If you ask people familiar with history why armor, particularly plate armor, disappeared, opinions will vary. Some will recall the rise of well-organized infantry in the 14th and 15th centuries, while others will note the emergence of heavy crossbows with steel bows. However, most will associate the decline of medieval protective gear with the spread of firearms. Some may even argue that armor never disappeared entirely and continued to be used to a lesser extent in Europe until the 20th century. However, regardless of these differing views, the main reason for the decline of steel plate armor was its diminishing effectiveness. To delve deeper into the question, let's consider the increased interest in historical reconstruction and fencing in recent decades, which has shed light on some important aspects. Knightly armor was not as cumbersome as previously believed. It allowed for relatively swift movement and, most importantly, provided substantial protection to the wearer. However, if we shift our focus to the transition from the Middle Ages to the early modern period, it is primarily associated with massive infantry armies whose protection largely relied on their attire. Why would one need armor that cannot stop a bullet? At first glance, this statement seems accurate, but the reality is more nuanced. In the majority of conflicts in the modern and contemporary eras, a significant percentage, according to some reports, more than half of the casualties were caused not by bullets, but by shrapnel and canister shot. The lethality of shrapnel, such as the artillery grenade of 1812, which would explode into dozens of fragments, depended on the mass of the shrapnel itself and the distance to the target. In certain situations, any additional protection could have benefited the wearer. There is evidence that the use of breastplates by infantry reduced casualties by several tens of percentage points. Similarly, helmets, while not able to withstand a direct bullet impact, reduced fatalities by 12–13% and injuries by 30% during World War I. However, why is there much more emphasis on developing new weapons rather than protective gear in modern and contemporary times? Strangely enough, a knight in the 15th century was better protected than a soldier in the 19th or even the 20th century. To understand this paradox, we must consider who the knights were. They were feudal lords, individuals who owned land and peasants who generated income from that land. To comprehend the phenomenon of knighthood, let's imagine a few situations that serve as rough analogies. Imagine living in a society where the defense of the state is entrusted to people who own relatively successful businesses. What kind of weapons and protective gear would such an army possess? Most likely, they would have the best equipment that their finances could afford, as they were not poor individuals. Now, imagine that the situation changes, and these business owners are told that they can stay home while they are required to send 100 or even 200 employees to defend the state. What kind of equipment would these employees have? Clearly, it would not match what their bosses had. Essentially, this described situation serves as a rough analogy to the transition to the new era and the new army. Indeed, it would have been possible to invest efforts into producing decent protective gear for a theoretical 1,000 infantrymen, reducing casualties by 20–30%. However, with the same resources, one could arm another 1,000 soldiers or even more. The production of a full set of armor required much more steel, labor, and time compared to manufacturing a musket. Consequently, according to the author's opinion, it was not the weakness of armor but rather the economic impracticality that led to their demise. Wealthy bourgeois individuals who replaced feudal knights had no need to participate directly in combat. Additionally, there was no intention to develop and employ advanced protective gear for common soldiers, who were often former peasants. As a result, elite cuirassier units continued to exist until the 19th century, and officers in several European countries still used armor and helmets. However, the common foot soldier was generally not equipped with protective gear. In conclusion, it can be stated that it was not the armor that disappeared, but rather those who could afford it and for whom it was primarily manufactured. This, in turn, hindered the development of protective gear. Interestingly, even in modern times, many armies lack basic body armor, which cannot be considered the result of extensive and meticulous research. Kevlar, for example, was originally developed for reinforcing automobile tires. If the author were inclined towards conspiracy theories, they might argue that the portrayal of easily penetrable armor in various contemporary movies aims to convince ordinary individuals of their uselessness. preventing potential fighters from dwelling on why they are less protected from harm in the 21st century compared to medieval warriors.